None of those plants survive even one day of the planting season because something happens and we switch, and that switch is something else. And
Right.
and by the time, it's like, do you want the current planting schedule, or you want the one that was this morning, or and
I'm running as fast as I can.
yeah, or rain happens and we have to switch to a field that's dry, or just someone leaked water into a field and we have to wait a few days on that one, so we go over here and
Yeah, it's
Well-
priorities, and
Yeah.
I developed a file one time I worked at a job, and it was my Scarlet O'Hara file. I'll think about it tomorrow. There were a few things that it's like, okay, this one's gonna have to go.
okay.
over
I
there.
know, there are a lot of things
It's
I
not
would,
top
I do
priority.
have a list of things
Well,
that's
it's
for
nicer
later.
than saying the
Just-
Rhett Butler file, and frankly, my dear, I don't give up.
Right. Well, Marvin, that is a great lead into segue into our topic today.
Okay.
Because we are going to be talking about planting and harvesting and when and all of that, because
Please not pruning.
not pruning today. Not
Okay.
pruning today. But we're in Leviticus 24 and 25, and this morning we got through most of 24 and into 25, but then we stopped. We made a cut point there because there's a lot of content here, and so I'll make sure and stop at the same place so we can start up again next time. And the timing of this, the topic of this ties very well into what we were doing last week. Eve, do you remember how much time has passed during Leviticus or Marvin, beginning of Leviticus to the end of Leviticus? Judy?
40
One?
years?
1 month.
1 month?
Yes, can you believe that? It feels like 40 years, doesn't it?
Yeah. This class is gone for
Yeah, I know. Well, when we went through Genesis, it was hundreds of years, thousand some years.
Yeah.
We went through Exodus. That's not that was Moses' lifetime. So we got maybe 80 years, but most of it was about the Exodus part. That was just a year. It took them a year to get from Egypt to the
Right.
base of Mount Sinai. So now at the base of Mount Sinai, they're there for 1 month. So all these things we're learning about, they were learning about for the first time. This is what God told them originally to do. These things we're reading about, taking care of all the tabernacle and all that. Now, if we look into the future, just thinking about where this is in time, if we think about this, now these instructions are given right now during this month. In Numbers, when we start Numbers, they count up the people. They create a banner for each family group. They have a certain place they're going to walk, and they're given the chores for moving the tabernacle. Okay? So that happens during Numbers, and they begin to move. But how long is it from this 1 month time till they start moving and get to the edge of the promised land? 40 years. 40 years. Then they get to the edge of the promised land, and what happens? When they leave this and they go to the edge of the promised land, what happens? Do they go right in? Remember, they went to go get the
Well, 40 years
grapes.
was after they got there.
That's what I'm saying. So I'm sorry, I didn't say it correctly. So there's 1 month of Leviticus right now. Then they're going to walk over to the promised land. They're going to travel, so it's going to take a little
Right.
while there. When they get to the edge of the promised land, they're going to go in and conquer it and take it, right?
Yeah, that's the plan.
we
but
know.
They send in their spies.
The spies, yeah.
12 men went down to spy on Canaan. 10 were bad and 2 were good. Some saw giants big and tall. Some saw grapes and clusters fall. Some saw God was over all. 10 were bad and 2 were good. And as a result, they spent another 40 years in the desert. So they traveled a year. They waited a month. I'll find out how long it was from the time they traveled to the edge of the promised land. But then it was 40 years that they stayed out. Then when they went into the promised land, they had to conquer all those peoples, and that's another 40 years. So this stuff here that's talking about the land and who owns the land and when it's going to happen, they don't have any land yet. They're out at the base of Mount Sinai. These things are not going to happen until they get in the land. Now, the truth is that the stuff that we read about today never did last long. We're going to read about the Sabbath year and the Jubilee year. And neither of those, the Sabbath year was put into place some and is in place sort of right now even for some Jews who are following that tradition. But the Jubilee year never did. We don't have any historical evidence that they actually celebrated the Jubilee year. So the other practices, they did put into play, at least in some form, but these two we're going to read about today, they never really they never lasted long or was really fully implemented. So let's find out what it was they didn't do and why. So in Leviticus 24, I want to remind you of last week. So last week we talked about the sacred time, and I have the list up here so you can see. Make sure you can see the sacred time, and you can see the 7 kinds of sacred time. There was the Passover, the unleavened bread, the first fruits, the Pentecost, the trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles. Okay? So that's about the sacred time. And those were 7, on the Jewish calendar, there were 7 major periods of sacred time or holidays. And remember, the word holidays is from holy days, set apart days. So these holidays, these 7 holy days, were set apart and they were established. Now in 24 to 25, we see the extension of sacred time to include every 7 years. So we had before, every 7 days you would have a Sabbath. Now we say that every 7 years you have a sabbatical year. And every 7 times 7 you have a Jubilee year. Okay, so you got 7 days and the 7th day is a Sabbath, right? Now you're going to have 7 years, and 6 years you're going to plant, and the 7th is going to be the sabbatical year. So you have the Sabbath, which is the 7th day, and you have the sabbatical year, which is the 7th year. And then you have 7 times 7, which equals 49. You have 49 years, and then the 50th year is the Jubilee year.
So, the 49th year is the sabbatical year.
The 50th is actually the sabbatical year. 49 years. Oh, I'm sorry. Every 7 years is the sabbatical year. The Jubilee year is the 49 plus 1. The plus 50th year is Jubilee.
Okay.
Jubilee means 50.
Yeah. And I've never known a farmer to take every 7th year off and just
Nope.
leave his farm alone.
No one does. However, we do have a lot of history from ancient times even of the practice of leaving ground fallow and rotating crops. And one of the things that the Jews did, some of them did do the Sabbath year for a while, but it quickly, disintegrated to the point that no one was really doing it.
Well,
And they did things like, instead they'd say, well, we'll take a turn, we'll make this crop rest here and we'll keep there. So they were continually having income and growing. But as we're going to see, we're going to look at why God set up what he did and what his purpose was. And then we'll see.
well, there are areas in our country of our central plains, but that get less rainfall than some of the real fertile places like Iowa, and but that at least in my lifetime, a lot of farmers had a practice of what they call strip farming, where they would basically leave half their land unplanted every year, and then the next year they would plant that and leave what they did unplanted. And the main purpose was that land could still absorb and retain moisture in its profile through that year that would help the crop the following year, and the other one was all depleted because they didn't get enough rain to really replenish everything every year.
So God gave the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year to his people, the Israelite people. The requirements and the things of this did not apply to everybody.
Right.
But we do see in farming generally this concept of not stripping the soil of all of its nutrients, of
Right.
letting the land lay fallow for water, or for just so that you're not stripping all the nutrients out of maybe planting a different crop that has different nutrients that some add to the soil. Sometimes you plant a crop
Right.
that you may not even harvest. You grow it and you till it under so that it'll add nutrients to that soil for your next crop you're going to put. We have all kinds of farming techniques like that. But there's a difference here, because this is something that God told the Jewish people to do. And he specifically said it's not Jewish. the Israelites to do. When he said that, he was not including everybody. He included that other people are going to be doing something different. But he made promises that went along with them doing this, that if they did this, he was going to do some things.
And it wasn't, on my mind, it wasn't really a, farm management issue he was talking about. It was a spiritual issue.
So let's get to that. Let's
Yeah.
read it. You're exactly right. Let's get to it.
Yeah.
So here, so we have the idea. You have the idea that a sabbatical year means you're going to have within 7 years, the 7th year, just like the Sabbath day of the week, the 7th year of the week of years will be the sabbatical year. And on the 7 weeks, 7 weeks of years, then you would have the Jubilee year, which would be the 50th year. So these together ensured, listen to this, that there is neither poverty nor wealth. Now when we talk about rotating the crops and all, we talk about the produce. If we do this, we can manipulate to get more wealth. This system that God set up for his people would not produce wealth, because you'll see the way he set it up, everything gets reset at the end of a generation. So in 50 years, all the land goes back to the original owner. No matter what other deals you made, the land was supposed to go back to the original owners. So if you rented your land or leased your land, it can only be for those years till the Jubilee year, and then everything goes back to the owner. So God's system isn't going to be very popular in our culture if we were to say this is the way it's supposed to be all the time. But remember, this was not for everyone all the time. God told the Israelite people to do this, and we're going to see promises that he embedded in that. And he didn't make those same promises to us who are not Jewish. This was for them going into the land he had promised to them. And when did he intend for them to go in? They spent a month getting the instruction in Leviticus, and then they were supposed to walk from there to the promised land and go in. But no, instead, they had a 40-year, not unlike us, right? They had a 40-year time they spent in the desert, and the next generation is what came into the land. So we have to kind of get our head set around what happened. So before we move to those holidays that were, when we move away from the holidays that we just talked about, we need to remember that they were given 2 other instructions. So we have chapter 24 and chapter 25, and in chapter 24, it includes this other part. And it says that number 1, he's going to give them instructions on how to maintain the tabernacle on a daily basis. And then it's going to give this story of the blasphemer. So before we get to the sabbatical year and the Jubilee, it's going to set up this weird scenario, and you're going to go, how is this story of the blasphemer connected to taking care of the temple, and how does any of that have anything to do with what we're going to talk about in the sabbatical and Jubilee? So I'm telling you ahead of time what we're going to read in 25. I'm reminding you of what we read in 23, because you've got this weird chapter in between, and actually it is directly connected to both. And when we get to the end, I think you're going to see the connection more clearly. So we're going to take our mind and set aside sabbatical and Jubilee, because they don't know that yet. It's not been told to them yet. And we're going to read Leviticus 24, verses 1 to 4. The Lord said to Moses, "Command the Israelites to bring you clear oil of pressed olives for the light, so that the lamps may be kept burning continually." By the way, clear oil means virgin olive oil, because it did not burn with smoke. And so since you're going to be having this candelabra burning continually, you don't want to fill the tent with smoke. And we had a big discussion in the earlier class about whether it meant that they were going to light the lights only at night, or if continually meant day and night. And that, you can argue about that all day if you want to. I think what it's saying here is that the lights were tended to in the morning and the evening, so that they burned continually day and night.
That's what continually means.
And because the reason is there's no windows in the tabernacle, so there's no light. So if you would barely be able to see anything. Everything would be very dark. So that's my opinion. But outside the curtain that shields the Ark of the Covenant law in the tent of meeting, Aaron is to tend the lamps before the Lord from evening till morning continually. That's where the argument came in. Well, does that mean they're only burning from evening to morning? I think it means that every day, every morning, and every evening he went and took care of the lamps to make sure they stayed continually burning. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. The lamps on the pure gold lampstand before the Lord must be tended continually. So here you go.
Pretty clear.
Well, it says tended continually, so however you want to interpret that, that's how I feel. Okay, look at here.
I'm wondering where they found the olives.
Well, olive oil was a common food that they used, so they may have even been carrying it with them.
Yeah.
That would have been something very common to have with them. When they build the temple in Jerusalem, that you heard of the Mount of Olives.
Right.
They had a olive garden,
Yeah.
grove, an olive tree grove, right beside the temple, because they were continually having to produce olive
Yeah,
oil.
I know
for
in
the
that region, almost all the cultures
It was a
grew
staple.
olives. What I
Mhm.
don't know is were they scattered across the countryside in
It
places
was a
that people
staple.
weren't tending them.
It was a staple,
Yeah.
something they had, you pretty much needed that for any kind of fat.
Yeah.
So, and they used it for fuel. So this is a picture of the candelabra that's in the area, and I have this little description down here to read it. The menorah is pure gold, and the lamp burns continually. It's a 7-branch candelabra with 3 tulips on each branch, so people can see it, and a cup at the top that holds the olive oil, and it's made of one piece of solid gold. And every day, morning and evening, oil is replenished, and it lights the interior of the tabernacle until the tabernacle gets moved. When it gets moved, we'll see in Numbers, it describes this whole process of what they've got to do to move the tabernacle. So when they do that, there's somebody who's in charge of this menorah, and that's their job. It's so funny. It's like they say, okay, now this family is going to do this, and then they would designate in that family, okay, Joe Schmo, you are in charge of the candelabra, and that would be like his life job is to be the one who carries the candelabra when it moves. And then when they get to the new place, he sets it up, and that was his part. And everybody had a part in what they needed to do. And did you know these are lilies? Tulips, I'm sorry, tulips.
Yeah.
Tulips, 3 tulips on each branch.
And you can see by that, and if you've never actually seen them, in person, you can still get the idea that someone does need to tend to that because there's only so much oil that could go in those cups that you found, right?
I think this was pretty big though. I should have looked up how big it is. I think it's a pretty big, because I believe it stood on the floor. I think it stood from the floor and came up. I'll have to check on that and see what the size was of it. It's a pretty big, I think
A lot of things of the tabernacle are, the sizes are described in scripture. I don't know if
yeah,
that's one
I
of them.
didn't look it up, so
Yeah.
I'll look up and see if I can see. Okay, so take a look at Leviticus chapter 24, verses 5 to 9. Take the finest flour and bake 12 loaves of bread using 2/10 of an ephah for each loaf. Arrange them in 2 stacks, 6 on each stack, on the table of pure gold before the Lord. By each stack, put some pure incense as a memorial portion to represent the bread and to be a food offering presented to the Lord. This bread is to be set out before the Lord regularly, Sabbath after Sabbath, on behalf of the Israelites as a lasting covenant. It belongs to Aaron and his sons, who are to eat it in the sanctuary area, because it is a most holy part of their perpetual share of food offerings presented to the Lord. So each Sabbath, when they were doing their holy stuff, what would they do? Take this bread and eat of it in remembrance of me. It's like our communion. That's the model of the communion that we take. So what was that bread like after spending a week in the tabernacle?
I'm trusting it was miraculously fresh.
It was probably something like the little biscuit we just had this morning, right? Kind of toasty and dry.
Oh,
Here's a picture of it.
okay.
So the bread was placed on the table of showbread, the 12 loaves, 2 sets of 6. See the 2 sets of 6? With cups filled with frankincense. This is frankincense. And a gold vessel with wine. And those were replenished each week. They were all week left out, and then the priest would eat them like a dry cracker. The light from the menorah, the bread and wine, the oil and incense, the virgin olive oil provides the fuel with no smoke. Okay, so that's interesting. Okay, great. That's telling us the details of how the tabernacles be set up. Now we have this story. And where does this come in? Why all of a sudden do we have this story? In Leviticus 24, verse 10. Now the son of an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father. Okay, so who's that? An Israelite mother and an Egyptian father. That would be one of the mixed multitude. Remember when we read in Exodus 2, I think it was, that they had a mixed multitude that went with them? Those would be people who were, like in this case, here's a boy whose mother is an Israelite, but father was an Egyptian. So he's along with them. So remember, the rules we've read have been different based on who you are, right? So this Israelite mother and Egyptian father went out among the Israelites, and a fight broke out in the camp between him and an Israelite. This term, a fight broke out, is like, it's more violent than like just a fight broke out. It'd be like a brawl. We might say it was a brawl, like it was really, they were really going at it. It's the same word when Moses in Exodus, when Moses sees two men fighting, and he says, why are you fighting with one another? Remember, Moses sees them fighting? That was also the same verb that's used here. It's like an all-out brawl, like they're really at each other. It's not like they're having a little argument. Verse 11, the son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name with a curse. So they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shelomith, the daughter of Dibri, the Danite. Okay, remember that. We're going to come back to that.
Does that mean the tribe of Dan?
Yeah, so what's the deal here? Who cares what his mother's name? What's the guy's name? We don't know. But we're going to come back to this. They put him in custody until the will of the Lord should be made clear to them. So what does that tell you? They don't know what to do about this. What are we supposed to do about this? So God tells them, verse 13, then the Lord said to Moses, take the blasphemer outside the camp. All those who heard him are to lay their hands on his head, and the entire assembly is to stone him. Say to the Israelites, anyone who curses their God will be held responsible. Anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord is to be put to death. The entire assembly must stone him, whether foreigner or native born. When they blaspheme the name, they are to be put to death. Oh my goodness. What in the world?
Here we go.
Let's go back to the non-controversial stuff, like the showbread and the lampstand, and all of a sudden we're into this thing. So this seems really odd. It seems like a weird place to have this story, but let me give you some more information. Let's read on from 17 through 23. Anyone who takes the life of a human being is to be put to death. Okay, now wait a minute. Now we're going to see this rules on putting people to death. We just talked about blaspheming, right? Now we've got this section. Anyone who takes the life of someone's animal must make restitution, life for life. Anyone who injures their neighbor is to be injured in the same manner, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The one who has inflicted the injury must suffer the same injury. Whoever kills an animal must make restitution, but whoever kills a human being is to be put to death. You are to have the same law for the foreigner and the native born. Do you hear that? The foreigner and the native born. I am the Lord your God. Then Moses spoke to the Israelites, and they took the blasphemer outside the camp and stoned him. The Israelites did as the Lord commanded Moses. So why are they supposed to do this? I am the Lord your God, because I said so, because God said so. Remember the story of one of Abraham's, remember he had a daughter, was it Abraham? Who had the daughter? And the daughter went off with one of the local people, and the brothers went in and killed the two brothers. Was Israel's sons, two of Israel's sons? They went in and said, well, our family member girl, she can't marry one of you guys unless you're all circumcised. So if you all get circumcised, then we'll make a deal with you. So they get circumcised, and then the two brothers go in and slaughter him, kill him, right? Yes. Was that an eye for an eye?
No.
What God is doing here is he's setting up what his standard is. He's saying you don't get to choose how you handle these matters. If something is wrong done, then the judgment will be an equal wrong would happen, not more. You're not going to go in and kill the whole town because your sister wanted to run away with this guy who was not from the Jewish people. So, if we look back at the story of the young man who was killed for blaspheming, okay? If you look back at that, the name of the mother was Shelomith. She was the daughter of Dibri of the tribe of Dan. We don't know the name of the young man, but we're told the name of his mother and grandfather and tribe. The young man did two bad things. He cursed God and he blasphemed.
You should have known better.
This lady, Mary Douglas, she wrote a book called Leviticus' Literature in 1999, and she had a very insightful consideration of why this story fits between the procedures in the tabernacle and how this fits together. She said, to curse, the word to curse is to despise or to make contemptible. To blaspheme has the same verbal stem as to pierce. So the word curse is to despise or make contemptible, and blaspheme is the same word as to say to pierce. So if I blaspheme God, I'm piercing him with words. So the young man made God contemptible, piercing with words the name of the Lord. In retribution, the Lord commanded that he be stoned. The stone means literally to hurl or to pelt. It's like saying the blasphemer hurled insults at the name of God, so God had him die by the stones being hurled at him. The blasphemer's mother's name is Shelomith, suggesting retribution. Her father's name, Dibri, is word for lawsuit. And his mother was to the tribe of Dan, and the name Dan was from the word judgment. So the names have meaning, and so do most Hebrew names in Scripture. So let me read it like this to you and see if it makes more sense. Once upon a time, there was a man with no name, a nobody, neither Egyptian nor Israelite, son of a woman named Retribution, grandson of Lawsuit, of the tribe of Judgment. And he pelted insults at the Lord's name. So the Lord said, then it is my judgment that he die. He pelted my name, so he shall be pelted with stones and forever remain nameless, a nobody.
Makes a lot more sense, doesn't it?
It really connects, it makes the scripture really connect. And then when he goes into the eye for eye, tooth for tooth, he's saying that you as a people are going to come into these squabbles between you over things like this. And these are the things that are important. No one should insult my name. Don't allow people to deface what's holy. What's holy is me, your God. I'm taking care of you. So don't attack that. That's got to stay holy, set apart. And you're going to be different from other people. You're not going to give back twice as bad for what happened to you. You're not going to get retribution. If something happens, your courts, your judges, your priests, your people, you're going to decide based for an eye, tooth to equal value. Not that it has to be, not that you have to poke out somebody's eye because you lost an eye, but the value of that eye, the idea that it's the same, not that you're going to gain something by an injury done to you. So it's a different kind of way of thinking than that was set up. So this tit for tat kind of punishment sets up how to judge these situations. He's telling them how to judge these conflicts that are going to occur between people. So that goes along with the procedures of the menorah and the bread and all the other temple things. He's saying, so then when someone breaks the rule, this is how you're going to make those decisions. So then in 25 then, we start going into the Sabbath rest of the land. So that's also setting them apart and making them different, right? And we can argue all we want to about why God set up the tit for tat, the equal judgment and all that. But what does God say? Why does he say the reason? Because I am the Lord your God. So whatever, you can argue with it all day long, but he's saying, I, God, am establishing this for you. This is what you will do. No matter what other people do, this is how you will do it. Okay, so look at chapter 25 now. Let's see how this connects to what we see in chapter 25. The Lord said to Moses at Mount Sinai, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. Now, when we talked about the Sabbath on the days, what did we talk about would happen in our minds if we gave a day of time to rest and reflection on God? What happens to the importance of other things in our life when we do that?
They play second fiddle.
It kind of gets you oriented to what's the priority, right? It kind of sets what's most important. You're not working because you're setting aside that time for God. So work takes a second place to God. You're spending time with your family, but it's relaxing time, fellowship time. You're not ignoring your family, but you're actually spending time with them. And you're focusing on God. Like we do on Sunday, we come to church, we go to Sunday school, we learn, we grow, we get stimulated. It helps our faith grow, right? So that time is set apart to God. So if we set aside a Sabbath to God, and the land has a year of Sabbath rest, what is the message then to the farmers? These are farmers, they're going to be agrarian. What would that say? That God is more important than your farm, than your livelihood. Verse 3, for 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather their crops. But in the 7th year, the land is to have a year of Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. The land is to have a year of rest. Whatever the land yields during the Sabbath year will be food for you, for yourself, your male and female servants, and the hired worker and temporary resident who live among you, as well as for your livestock and wild animals in your land. Whatever the land produces may be eaten. So crop rotation and letting the land lay fallow, we talked about that a little bit with Marvin before we started, but that goes back, we see evidence of that back to 6000 BC. This concept of letting land lie fallow is not an unusual idea. Near Eastern farmers alternated the planting of legumes and cereal. They were practicing like a 2-field crop rotation. They might not have known the exact science of it, but it worked. They knew it worked. There's a Roman statesman we have in 234 to 149 BC who wrote a book called On Agriculture. And it talked about that farmers would save carefully for their goat, their sheep, the cattle, and other dung, and then use that to fertilize and replenish the soil and improve its structure. So farming was something they were doing and talking about and sharing good techniques that worked. And this idea of leaving the land fallow or letting it become enriched, that was already something talked about. But the sabbatical year was what then put into place for the Jews was different, because they were to just let their land, all their land, on that year, all their land for all the Jews would not be purposely growing anything, and they were supposed to leave it alone.
What grows on its own accord of your harvest, you shall not reap nor gather.
But I don't know, maybe there's a language issue that I don't understand here, because it says in verse 5, do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. And then the very next verse, it says, whatever the land yields during the Sabbath will be food for you. How are you going to take it as food if you don't harvest it?
He says later on that God says that he will provide enough. Later on, he says that he will provide enough harvest in the 6th year to carry them 3 years. And he says why? Because you got the year that it's fallow, then you've got the year that you plant, and then it'll be the next year for you get a really good harvest. So God himself says later that they will reap enough in the 6th year to last them the 3 years till they get their next harvest.
Okay, but
And it says whatever the land yields during the Sabbath year will be food for you, yourself, your others. I see what you mean. It like contradicts what said just
Yeah,
before.
almost.
Harvesting, like I'm gonna harvest.
How do you
this,
take
I'm
and
gonna
eat it
take
if you don't
in,
harvest it?
Right. So
and I'm just gonna take what I eat.
right, you're
But
not.
maybe it's a.
But he says, "Do not reap what grows of itself, or harvest the grapes of your untended vines."
Maybe it's
The land
going
is a
out
temple.
when you need it each day and taking some instead of actually having a harvest time where you bring it all in.
Yeah. What I'm. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, that what I'm, but I think that because of what it says in 5, that it's even meaning you just don't touch it, you let it lay there. I think personally, I think what verse 6 is talking about, that you've gathered up to the Sabbath, and that will be enough for you, that you'll have enough. And the reason I think that is because later on he says that he's going to give enough for them in the 6th year to be
Yeah.
able to survive. But here's the truth of the matter: they never did this. There's very little evidence that they ever had any true Sabbath year. What evidence we have is some of them did it in part. We don't have evidence that the Jews, once they did get in the land and once they began farming, that they really stuck with the Sabbath year. They'd have parties on the Sabbath year and stuff like that, but the idea that they wouldn't harvest anything, that doesn't seem to be something they ever actually practiced.
And was the theory that they were supposed to let all of their land? It wasn't like, I will let half my land be.
Right.
This half.
But that's what they did. They were supposed to have
Kind of
all of it go.
fudged.
Right. And
Yeah.
there were other farmers that were not Israelite farmers, that were not part of the Israelite land, so they could get crops and field stuff from other places. It's just they would not be growing it in their land.
Yeah,
And
we
God,
don't even have it recorded where they might have tried. Oh, let's just try this Sabbath year thing and see if it works. Did they ever
from
even try?
the only evidence we have is that people did consider it, and they did, like they'd have like certain parties and stuff, like that said, oh, this is the Sabbath year, and it looked like some may have rotated crops, but to actually let the ground be fallow. Also, and there's at least there was some attempt to do the Sabbath year. There were like a partial attempt, but the Jubilee year, we actually have no data that they ever did the Jubilee year thing. They just never did it.
Because it made no sense. The
Yeah.
guy who sold his farm, he did it because he was a drunken bum anyway. He couldn't pay his bills, and he had to sell it. And why would he give it back to that worthless family? And-
Right. So let's wait till we get the Jubilee year. You're right there. It does seem to be like a little. It's not very clear right there, but later he makes it more clear. I want to mention that. So the sabbatical year was in place. We now go to the Jubilee year.
Okay.
So the sabbatical year was 6 years you grow, and the 7th you lay fallow, right? And then God would provide. It's going to say later that God would provide for that year. Now, when you move to the Jubilee year, that's 7 times 7, so that's 49. Jubilee means 50. So the 50th year, everything that owned before would go back to the original ownership. Let's look at this in Leviticus 25, starting at verse 8. Count off 7 Sabbath years, 7 times 7 years. That's 49. So that the 7 Sabbath years amount to a period of 49 years. Then have the trumpet sounded everywhere on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the day of atonement. Sound the trumpet throughout your land. Consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It will be a jubilee for you. Each of you is to return to their family property and to your own clan. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. Do not sow and do not reap what grows of itself, or harvest the untended vines. For it is a jubilee and is to be holy for you. Eat only what is taken directly from the fields. In this year of jubilee, everyone is to return to their own property. So this verse kind of says it a little more clearly, but the way that the commentators are saying it is that when it says eat only what is taken directly from your fields, it's talking about the produce from the past 6 years, that you have grain and you have stuff stored up, and that's the stuff you're going to be using, but you're not going to go to your own field and pick your field. You're going to leave that lay. That because it describes specifically to leave alone what's in your field. So this eat only what is taken directly from the fields, they're interpreting to mean what you have stored up from the previous harvest. So in this year of Jubilee, everyone returns their own property. So could you sell land? No. You could lease land, you could sell it, but if no matter what you did, it had to go back to the family at the 50th year, at the Jubilee year. What this does is it prevents generational poverty, where people make a poor judgment and a mistake, and then the generations never have a chance to recoup. This resets it every 50 years, you're back to your own. So if you made a lease in the 49th year, you'd have to be a 1-year lease, because you'd have to just do it for that 1 year. If you made a lease in year 1, you could make it for up to that 49 years, because you would be going into the Jubilee year and have to return back. So could you lease with someone else that's not an Israelite? Let's go on. And the Jubilee year is based on 2 premises. Number 1, the land, Canaan, the promised land, must not be sold irrevocably. For the land is mine, the Lord's, and you, the Israelites, are but resident aliens under my authority. We'll read that later in chapter 25, verse 23. The land must not be sold irrevocably, for the land is mine, the Lord's, and you, the Israelites, are but resident aliens under my authority. That's how God views it. That's my land, not your land. I'm taking you there. You were slaves. I brought you out of slavery. I own you. He says in verse 25, the Israelites belong to me as servants. They are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I, the Lord your God. So from God's point of view, the Israelites are his because he bought them. How did he buy them? He bought them with the firstborn sons of all of Egypt. He bought them for a price. And he ransomed them and took them out of slavery, and now he's making them into a people. From God's point of view, they are his people, his servants, so you can't sell my servants, and you can't sell my land. The land is mine, and the people belong to me. Later on in Numbers 26, God's going to allocate a portion of the land to each of the tribes, and a portion which must always remain in its possession. They're the caretakers of his land. God's saying, you, my people, are going to go take care of my land, and you're my people, and that's my land, and you're going to take care of it for me, and it'll always remain in your possession. So they weren't supposed to sell or anything for a fixed amount of time. They were not supposed to give it to anyone else. Their ancestral home was their own land. So later, it should have been right after this, when they move on to the land of Canaan, they go in, that's when it should have been. They would have all had their own land, and that's what God was saying. This is my land, you're my caretakers of this land, and every 50 years, it's got to go back to the original caretakers. Dan, you're going to have this land, and so you're going to have this land, and so that. He spells it all out in Numbers, exactly who has what piece of land as they go into the land of Canaan.
Okay, so this goes back to what you were saying a minute ago about here they are, a month, learning, being told everything that they need to do for when they get there.
They're getting set up,
Okay.
And this is towards the end of Leviticus. So he's described the tabernacle and the different sacrifices and all that. But now toward the end, he's describing what they need to know as they move on. As they move on, they're going to need to know about the land and how things are going to work. So I want to give you an illustration of this principle, this practice that was going on. And the illustration is in 1 Kings. If you want to look at 1 Kings chapter 21, there's an incident that happens that is related to this whole idea of ownership of the land. 1 Kings chapter 21. Sometime later, there was an incident involving a vineyard belonging to Naboth, the Jezreelite. The vineyard was in Jezreel, close to the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. Ahab said to Naboth, "Let me have your vineyard to use for a vegetable garden, since it is close to my palace. In exchange, I will give you a better vineyard, or if you prefer, I will pay you whatever it's worth." Okay, should Naboth do that according to what we just read? It's not his to give. The land belongs to God. But Naboth replied, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors." So Ahab went home sullen and angry because Naboth the Jezreelite has said, I will not give the inheritance of my ancestors. He lay on his bed sulking and refused to eat. His wife, oh my goodness, who's the wife?
Jezebel. Oh my
Came
goodness,
in
what a-
and
what a-
asked
what a
him.
prize.
Came in and asked him, why are you so sullen? Why won't you eat? He answered her, because I said to Naboth the Jezreelite, sell me your vineyard, or if you prefer, I'll give you another vineyard in its place. But he said, I will not give you my vineyard. Jezebel, his wife, said, is this how you act as king over Israel? Get up and eat. Cheer up. I'll get you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name, placed his seal on them, and sent them to the elders and nobles who lived in Naboth's city with him. In those letters she wrote, proclaim a day of fasting and seat Naboth in a prominent place among the people, but seat 2 scoundrels opposite him and have them bring charges that he has cursed both God and the king. Then take him out and stone him to death. So the elders and nobles who lived in Naboth's city did as Jezebel dictated in the letters she had written to them. They proclaimed a fast and seated Naboth in a prominent place among the people. Then 2 scoundrels came and sat opposite him and brought charges against Naboth before the people, saying, Naboth has cursed both God and the king. So they took him outside the city and stoned him to death. Then they sent word to Jezebel, Naboth has been stoned to death. As soon as Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned to death, she said to Ahab, get up and take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite that he refused to sell you. He is no longer alive, but dead. When Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, he got up and went down to take possession of Naboth's vineyard. Naboth could not give what did not belong to him. And the stoning goes back to the blasphemer instruction we saw before, right? So here in this example, we have kind of a combination of those two ideas. The concept that the land belongs to Israel, they can't give it away. And where though are Naboth's people? He was the patriarch, so where's his, in other words, the land should have then gone to whoever his successor was, right? But what would his family have been concerned about?
You might get stoned,
Yeah, Jezebel was a formidable foe, and they can see what's going on, so they just are silent and let that happen because, you know, they saw what happened to the patriarch, so. Go ahead and say it, Eve.
Is it kind of giving the wrong message?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. This is a bad story.
Yeah.
When we read First Kings, it's one of the examples how evil the kings had become that were ruling in the kingdom during that time. The most of the kings that came in after Solomon, David, and then Solomon, starting with Solomon, they got really bad. It was hard to find ones that were good. There's only a few that actually did what they were supposed to do, which was part of when Jesus, we're going to read in the New Testament where Jesus here, right here. In fact, we're going to read it right now. Eve, take a look at Matthew 21. We were in 1 Kings 21, right? Mm-hmm. Now we're in Matthew 21. Take a look at Matthew 21. Jesus is going to tell a parable, Eve, and you'll see how he sees it from his view. Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it. I'm sorry, I'll wait for you. I want you to be able to see it there. Ready?
Where are we?
Verse 33 of chapter 21.
Gotcha.
I'm sorry. Are you ready yet, Judy? Okay. Okay, listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved to another place. Is he allowed to do that?
Sure.
Sure. When the harvest time approached, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his fruit. In other words, that's the rent. The rent is the fruit of the field. They give a portion to him because he's the one who owns the field. Verse 35, the tenants seized his servants. They beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. Remember that. They beat, killed, and stoned. Then he sent other servants to them, more than the first time, and the tenants treated them the same way. Last of all, he sent his son to them. They will respect my son, he said. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to each other, this is the heir. Come, let's kill him and take his inheritance. So they took him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to these tenants? He will bring those wretches to a wretched end, they replied, and he will rent the vineyard to other tenants who will give him his share of the crop at harvest time. Jesus said to them, have you never read in the scriptures, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce its fruit. Anyone who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone whom it falls will be crushed. When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard Jesus' parables, they knew he was talking about them. They looked for a way to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowd because the people held that he was a prophet. So in this story that Jesus tells, this sounds like a real story of that time, but it's not. God is the landowner who's planted a vineyard. The vineyard is Israel. The tenants in charge of tending the vineyard are the religious leaders and the priests. So, and that's who Jesus is talking to, right? The tenants. When it came time to get the produce, the landowner, God, sent his servants who would be the prophets. What did they do, the prophets? Beat, killed, stoned. So he sent his son, who they killed. The land will be taken from you, the religious leaders, and given to those who do it correctly. So Christ came, Christ himself used this scenario to explain what's happening with him. He came as the son, and they rejected the son, killed him. And so now they're going to have a penance to pay for that. So the Israelites belong to God. Not only the land, but the people themselves belong to God. And that is why the Israelite cannot be a slave owned by someone else. At worst, he could be indentured for a fixed period of time. It's a radical concept because in this time, the society is patriarchal, monarchy, you have monarchical, polytheistic, and slaveholding. To say the Israelites belong to the Lord, cannot be slaves, is radical, especially since they just spent 400 years in slavery. So as we go on in chapter 25, it's going to break this rule or this idea that the Israelites are slaves and say, not only does the land belong to me, but you as a people belong to me. You're a slave to no one. So this Jacob Milgrom, this last part, it kind of has this weird sequence that goes on. That's a little bit hard to kind of understand how it connects. This guy, Jacob Milgrom, he kind of gave a good kind of summary that puts it in plain English that will help us understand the last part of chapter 25. If he, the Israelite, has not observed sabbaticals and jubilees, he will ultimately sell his movable possessions. Okay, do you see that's an if-then kind of statement? If the Israelite has not observed the sabbaticals and jubilees, in other words, he's doing something wrong, he will ultimately sell his possessions that he has. If he repents, that's fine. In other words, he does that, but he repents, that's fine. But if he does not repent, he's going to end up selling his land. If he repents from selling his land, that's fine. But if he doesn't, he's going to end up having to sell his house. And if he repents from that, that's fine. But then he'll end up having to go begging. And if he repents from that, that's fine too. He will ultimately end up having to sell himself to another Israelite if he doesn't repent. And he could repent from that, but if he doesn't, he's going to end up selling himself to a Gentile. Not only himself, but all of Israel. In other words, if God's people put themselves under bondage with Gentiles, he's completely outside of God's hand then. And so this next part, this next section, that's what it deals with, this idea. If this, then that. If you do this, then that will happen. If you repent, good, but then that's this to worry about. So there's 7 movements in the next chapter, and the statement about Jubilee is followed by the 6th the 6 if-then statements. Okay, we're almost there. We're almost to the cut point here. Leviticus 25:14-24. Okay, ready for the if-then? If you sell land to any of your own people or buy land from them, do not take advantage of each other. You are to buy from your own people on the basis of the number of years since the Jubilee, and they are to sell to you on the basis of the number of years left for harvesting crops. When the years are many, you are to increase the price, and when the years are few, you are to decrease the price, because what is really being sold to you is the number of crops. Do not take advantage of each other, but fear your God. I am the Lord your God. Follow my decrees and be careful to obey my laws, and you will live safely in the land. Then the land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and live there in safety. You may ask, what will we eat in the 7th year if we do not plant or harvest crops? Remember we talked about that? I will send you such a blessing in the 6th year that the land will yield enough for 3 years. While you plant during the 8th year, you will eat from the old crop and will continue to eat from it until the harvest of the 9th year comes in. I feel like that's pretty clear. The land must not be sold permanently, because the land is mine, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. Throughout the land that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. So on Jubilee year, to come out of the scripture, on Jubilee year, all the land reverts back to its owner. So you can lease the land, but the longest is up until the Jubilee year. So this parable, this idea that you can't be charged more than the value of the annual crops, is because you're charging other Israelites. How would you do this with someone who is not an Israelite? You can do it with someone who's not an Israelite, but then how would you make sure that they go out of the land? You'd have to make sure you did all your contractual agreements. And it's God's land, so why are you letting someone who's not an Israelite harvest in God's land? So remember the manna? What would they do? What would they get on the 6th day of the manna?
Double portion.
Double portion. So this is like saying, just like the manna, I provided for you so that on the 7th day you did not gather manna. Same thing with your crop. I'm going to provide for you on the 6th year so that you can have what you need for the 7th year and 8th year, because you might need to plant. And in the Jubilee year, even another year, because you've got Jubilee year interfering. So God's saying he's going to provide. So the Sabbath years were observed in Israel, in modern Israel, in 1951. Most recently in 2014, we did see people observe the Sabbath year. That was the last Sabbath time. So they should have done it again in 21, would it be? Right? I don't know if they did, do you know? Currently, the Jews consider hydroponic greenhouses as okay, since they don't involve soil.
Okay.
They also import and purchase from other localities, but not Israelites. So there are some that are trying to observe that. Leviticus 25, this is where we're going to end today. 25 to 28. If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. However, there is no one to redeem it for them, but later on they prosper and acquire sufficient means to redeem it themselves. They are to determine the value for the year since they sold it and refund the balance to the one to whom they sold it. They can then go back to their own property. But if they do not acquire their means to repay, what was sold will remain in the possession of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. It will be returned in the Jubilee, and they then can go back to their property. So even if they don't have money to buy it back, they go back to their ancestral land at Jubilee, at the year of Jubilee. So there are only 3 ways to get your land back. The kinsman redeemer can buy it back on your behalf. So someone who's in your family, remember the story of Ruth and Boaz? That's the kinsman redeemer. That must be your nearest relative. They must have the resources, the cash to do it, and they must be willing to do it. You can't force someone to do it. They have to be willing to do it.
So that's how Boaz got Ruth, because her closest person
Relative.
didn't want to.
That's right. That person had the first option. So you have to have the resources to do it, and you have to be willing to do it. So the other way to get your land back is to return the money, whatever you had the price on it, on the property. And the third way is to wait until the year of Jubilee. So if all else fails, you're going to have to wait until Jubilee before the land comes back to you. So as Boaz was Ruth and Naomi's kinsman redeemer, so is Christ our kinsman redeemer. He is our nearest relative. He's both fully God and fully man. He is sinless himself, so he has the resources to redeem us. Because he was without sin, he has the price. And third, he went willingly. The kinsman redeemer has to be willing. And that's why it was so important that Christ was not forced to do the cross. And that's why the scripture emphasizes so much that he willingly went to the cross, because that was the part of being the kinsman redeemer. So next time, we're going to start with the kinsman redeemer, and we're going to look at Galatians chapter 3 and 4. I've listed these scriptures are the scriptures that we'll start with next time to remind ourselves what we were talking about, this connection to Christ as the kinsman redeemer. This was all linked with that Sabbath year and the Jubilee year. That was a very direct link. And their scriptures in Galatians will be the one we'll focus on, but it's also in Titus, 1 Peter, Romans, 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, Colossians, Hebrews. All talks about this idea that Christ redeemed us from the old law, from what was before, and has paid the price so that we could enter this new covenant. So that's what we'll start with next time. Okay. What I did to find those scriptures is I used the concordance and looked up Redeemer, kinsman redeemer. So if you want to look at all the places where it's mentioned, I would encourage you can do that. There's not tons of them. These are just the ones that were in the New Testament. But we'll really focus on the Galatians chapters 3 and 4, because it really kind of goes through the whole thought there in a certain passage. So, and then we'll finish out chapter 25 then. Okay?